I don't know.
I think if you have two locations in one grid.
Well, so here you could actually have a continuing decline in the number of mature individuals and not in the area of occupancy. But that's not the case. Here they've distinctly stated that the area of occupancy is declining. And the individuals are all found, this is a 2 by 2 kilometer grid, so you could have this situation. But they're obviously not considering each individual to be a separate subpopulation. And I don't know why.
Yeah, I suspect that perhaps the assessors haven't considered that. They've gone straight for the obvious. Like, we know that this is an area of occupancy, we know that there's continuing decline in population size and individuals. But they haven't really considered the subpopulation aspect. They probably just overlooked it. But they're still given enough information to qualify the species as critically endangered. So I think they're just overlooked it. And we've obviously not picked up on that detail enough to go back to them and say, look, if we look at this.
We don't actually have time to read every single assessment in depth because we're putting thousands of species on each year. So for little details like that, I think if someone had sent me this assessment with a continuing decline in the number of subpopulations and I were reviewing it, I would accept that because it makes sense. Particularly in this case, when there's obviously no genetic exchange, and each individual could theoretically be considered a subpopulation. So this happens a lot where people just don't state it because they didn't think about it, or because they don't really know enough about it, so they'd rather just leave it off, whereas they're not quite sure how those population dynamics work. So again, because of the threshold to list the species under endangered for B1AB 2, 3, and 5, or potentially 2, 3, 4, and 5, plus 2AB 2, 3, 4, and 5, or critically endangered B2, and you would always choose the highest category. So far we've got the species listed under critically endangered A2 plus 4, blah, 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 and critically endangered B2. So, I just gave away the first bit of the next one.
It's about in the case of archipelagos plant, how can you draw a minimal complex of pollen to calculate it? Yeah, right.
So this is something that we completely glossed over, but this is actually a very big point. The question was, if you have a plant that's found in an archipelago or an island chain, how can you draw the extent of occurrence around it when there's going to be ocean in between? And that's obviously unsuitable habitat. There are people who, the original concept of extent of occurrence meant that you would include that ocean, even though it's obviously unsuitable because, again, you're looking at the spatial spread of the species distribution. So even if you had one population in New York,
if you had one population in New York and you had the other population in London, then you would still include the entire ocean in between that, because if there was an atomic bomb, well, okay. If there was, some sort of catastrophic disaster in New York, the population in London would still be safe. So because that you have that huge distribution, that huge extent of occurrence, that accurately reflects that their species is widely distributed and therefore less threatened, because any event that it impacts one part of the population is less likely to impact the other part of the population. Whereas if you cut out all of the ocean in between, you're going to end up with a tiny area, and that would make it seem like one threatening event could impact the entire population, which actually gets more towards what area of occupancy is looking at measuring. There are people that simply don't agree with that and say that you should exclude unsuitable habitat. And at the moment, this is under review. We have historically frowned upon but allowed people to exclude unsuitable habitat, and for some of the assessments on the red list, they've done that when they calculate the extent of occurrence. We generally recommend that people don't do that, because what you end up doing is getting a value that's much more similar to the area of occupancy, and therefore you're not measuring those two different measurements of the species distribution.
And also, I mean, it becomes very subjective with what you decide is suitable and not. Because, like, the Cycad example, now we've got these cloud fields, which are actually unsuitable habitat. So, you know, it starts to be a lot more difficult to make decisions.
I mean, I always argue, and I think most of us in the red list unit would argue, that you should not exclude that habitat, because that's the whole point of extent of occurrence, is to measure how spatially spread out the various subpopulations are. But at least for the time being, there's a lot more detail in the user guidelines, but that is acceptable. And it's under review because it's actually a big issue. We need to resolve how we do this so it can be uniform across all the taxonomy groups. Yeah, that's a good question.
As Rebecca says, the criterion B, you have to, for all of these criteria, you have to remember what the red list criteria is designed for measuring. It's measuring extinction risk. And the extent of occurrence is not a range map. It's a polygon that indicates the spread of the extinction risk across the population. That's basically what it's doing. But as Rebecca said as well, the guidelines, the actual booklet, does have this statement that says you can remove large areas of this continuous habitat. And the guidelines give guidance on how to do that. So we have kind of put ourselves in this position of saying, yes, this is what it is, but you're allowed to do that. So that's an IUCN's fault for doing that in the first place. Anyway, okay. Red list criteria C, D, and E. I'm going to do them all together. And criteria C is a bundle of laughs. Criterion C is based on a small population size. So your population size is estimated usually, and a continuing decline. So it's not just a small population size on its own. There has to be a continuing decline in the population size. Okay. Right, now this is a criterion with several sub-criteria under it. There's C1 and there's C2, and then C2 has C2A and B and C2B, blah blah. It's got lots of sub-criteria. So do bear with me and tell me if you want me to go over this again after I've finished. So the first thing you have to qualify, to qualify for criterion C is to have a very small population size. So the thresholds on the summary sheet show for critically endangered, your population size would be less than 250 mature individuals. For endangered, it would be less than 2,500, and for vulnerable, less than 10,000 in the total global population. So quite small population sizes. So in the diagram here, again, simplified illustrations, we have, again, a species of tree. We're going with all the static things for these examples, and the fishy things. And here you can see it's clearly got a small population size. These are the numbers of individuals, mature individuals. As well as having a small population size, there is continuing decline. So run that again quickly. You can see there is, the individuals are disappearing. There is a decline. For criterion C1, that continuing decline would need to be at a specific rate within a specific time period. So that implies you need to have some data to use criterion C1. So not only is the population declining, but you've got some data to be able to say it's declining at 25% over 3 generations, or over 1 generation, or 3 years. Or it's declining at 20% in 5 years, or within 2 generations, etc. So you've got data there to be able to say that. Alternatively, if you don't have the data to say what the rate of decline is, but you do know there is a continuing decline going on, you can see that the population is declining, you just have no idea what rate, how fast it's going,
you can use criterion C2. It's much more common for people to use criterion C2, but people do use C1. If they have data, use C1. So in the example I've shown here, again, that full population, this is the whole global population, it's a very small population size. But you can see that it's been split into two different subpopulations. And one subpopulation is bigger than the other subpopulation. Now I've done this in the example because criterion C2, you need to have some kind of information about the structure of the population. It's, first of all, you meet the population size threshold, then you know there's continuing decline, then you have to be able to say something about the structure of the population. So you need to know whether all of the subpopulations are very small. So in this case, all of the subpopulations are very small, or that most of the mature individuals are in just one subpopulation. So in this example, both apply. They're both very small subpopulations, and most of the individuals, there's only 6, and 4 of those are in one subpopulation, so most of them are in one subpopulation. And just to emphasize this, on top of this structure, there is continuing decline as well. So when you put it like that, it shows it's in a really bad shape. Obviously, that's the extreme of like 6 individuals left. That's all fine, but there is another sub-criterion under criterion C. So if you know that there's a small population size and there's continuing decline, but you don't know about the population structure, but you do know that there are extreme fluctuations going on in the population size. So remember, extreme fluctuation is the fluctuation with the extreme of a 10-fold increase or decrease between the maximum and minimum values. You can then use that final sub-criterion. So here I've shown a small population. It's not broken into subpopulations or anything, although you could count that since everything occurs in one subpopulation effectively, it's all one population. But we don't know anything really about the structure. So in this example, we've got extreme fluctuation going on. So it's doing this kind of pattern over time, but along with that extreme fluctuation, it's also declining at the same time. So that is why, if I run it again, that is why eventually the overall population size is declining. That is basically criterion C, without going into any of the thresholds. Does that make sense, or do you want me to go over any of that? Okay. This is a slightly different way of viewing it. So, using the boxes and not fancy pictures. First thing you need is a small population size. Then you ask, do you have data to say there's continuing decline at a specific rate, or do you just know that there's general continuing decline going on? If the former, then use C1. If the latter, then use C2. But then you have to ask these other questions. What is the population structure like? Are there small subpopulations going on? Are most of the individuals in one larger subpopulation, or are there extreme fluctuations going on? This is what it looks like on your criteria summary sheet. So population size thresholds are given at the top, and I've already mentioned those. And then you need at least one of C1 or C2. If you don't have data, it's fine, you can still use C2. And all the details are given in your sheet now. Does anyone have any questions about the thresholds on this summary sheet for criterion C? Yeah.
I just have a question about the link between A and C. One is about, A is talking about population size reduction. That's also being covered in this C. So would you sometimes have both?
Sometimes you do have both being used, but if you notice in criterion C, first of all, you have to have this small population size. But for criterion A,
you don't. It can be well above those population sizes, but there's just been a massive decline in the past or whenever. But also in criterion C, these time thresholds are slightly different. We're looking at a 25% decline within 3 years or 1 generation, whichever is longer, whereas in criterion A, you're looking over a longer time period, looking over 3 generations. So it's a bit of more of a broader criterion for A.
It's more immediate.
Yeah, this is much more immediate, but you can have a combination of both. There's no linkage between any of the criteria. They're all independent criteria, so you can use a combination of them quite happily, or you can use just one. Ideally, when you're doing an assessment, you should go through what data you have and look at each criterion against the data you have. So if you have lots of population information, you look at criterion A, you assess it, but you don't stop there. You then look at what else you have, because you may have some kind of information that you can infer the range and use criterion B, or some information about the structure of the population, so you can use C or D or whatever. So we always recommend that you at least consider each of the 5 criteria. The consideration might well be, clearly I don't have any data on that, so I'll skip that. That's 1 second of consideration. But at least you've considered it and you've not missed the fact that, okay, you've assessed it as endangered under criterion A, but you might have missed that under criterion B it's actually critically endangered. So we do ask you to go through all of these.
You said to apply the criterion A, you need to survey more than 10 years, right? So how many years do you need to survey to apply this criterion C?
It's actually stated in the summary sheet there. So criterion C, if you have data to say there's a 25% decline, if that's within 3 years or 1 generation, whichever is the longer between the two. So for critically endangered, you would be using a minimum of 3 years or 1 generation if that's longer than 3 years. But then for endangered, you would be looking at a decline of 20% within 5 years or 2 generations, whichever is the longer. So it's actually stated there in the sheet.
Yeah, the reason why I ask this one is that because if we have a demographic data of the species, it is possible to project the future population size, even though we do not have observed data. So, I mean, how many years do we have to collect the raw data to apply this one?
For criterion C, you can actually use some data in the past and some in the future. You can actually project as well, as long as you have an estimate of the rate of decline over that full time period. So remember, in criterion A4, you can use some data in the past and project some into the future.
Yeah.
You can do the same for these time frames for criterion C. It's within that time period. It's quite a strangely worded criterion because it says within that time period, but it doesn't actually specify if that is within sort of between now and then, or if it's between back then and now, or when. But it's actually just within that time period. Okay. It could be better worded, I know. Really good. Okay. Criterion B. So we've talked about population reduction, we've talked about range of the species, and we've talked about population size with continuing decline. Sometimes you will have species where there is no decline, but there is a very, very small population size. So you have a very obvious concern for the future of that species. Criterion D covers that kind of scenario. Again, it's a slightly odd criterion because there's a criterion D, there's a D1 and there's a D2. Criterion D and D1 are based solely on having a very small population size. I'll go into what D1 and D2 mean in a second. But So it is enough to have an extremely small population size to qualify as one of the threatened categories under criterion D or D1. So for critically endangered, if you had a population size of less than 50 mature individuals left, you would use critically endangered D. You don't know if it's declining, you don't know what threats are there, you just know there's less than 50 mature individuals left. For endangered, if you've got less than 250, that's fine, qualifies for endangered under D. Criterion D2 is based on having a very restricted range or very few locations and a plausible threat being in place. Okay, so I'm going to show you what you can see in front of you on the summary sheet. You can see the row that I've highlighted. This refers to criterion D or D1. And you can see that D1 and D2 actually apply only to the vulnerable category. I did say it's an odd criterion. I think originally, I wasn't involved in